Hey everyone, welcome back to Bad Bassin'. Oftentimes when I'm fishing tournaments, I'm fishing on lakes that I've never fished before. So we're going to talk about 5 things that I look for to diagnose new lakes and find the fish. Now let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to look for is any land points or flats that extend out into the main body of the lake. So we're looking at anywhere between 5 to 8 feet of water that runs maybe 30 to 40 yards out into the main lake. So this is the type of area that you're going to see the density of the bass that are on these flats change sharply throughout the year. These are going to work really well during your springtime when the bass are coming up to these flats to spawn. Typically, I'm going to do some sort of horizontal moving bait in the water, like a jerk bait or a crankbait. And depending on the time of year, I might be also throwing a jig or some sort of Ned rig across some of these flats to get some of the bass that are moving up shallow. So the second thing that you're going to want to look for is underwater structure. Now, typically when people are referring to underwater structure, they're referring to the changes in the contours of the bottom of the lake. Now, I like to call those transition areas. So what you're really trying to find is sharp transition areas. So I'm looking for anywhere where it transitions from very shallow to very deep, typically about 4 to 5 foot of water to anywhere between 8 to 15 foot of water. Now you're going to want to do a little bit of homework to find these areas. You can either use some sort of app before you get to the lake to look at the transition areas that are in the lake and the contours of the underwater structure, or if you have the ability to use like a side scan or a down scan or something like that, then you can be able to map out the lake and be able to find these areas. Now I go into the Carolina rig a little bit more in the video that I'll link for you guys to watch. But the Carolina rig is a great rig to be able to get into the depths that you need to get to fast to mimic the bait fish and be successful when you're fishing transition areas. So the third thing I'm going to look for is weed lines. Now that's pretty self-explanatory, but essentially what it is when underwater vegetation grows up and meets open water. You're going to want to look for that transition area. Now this is going to vary year to year and also lake to lake in different times of the year. You're going to have obviously underwater vegetation start shallower, and then towards the end of the year you're going to see it grow up in the lake to where it's out a little bit deeper in the main body of the lake. I'm looking for any sort of those transition areas from those weed lines, preferably to me something that's in 8 to 10 foot of water. Those tend to hold on to bass a lot better. Now what are bass doing there? Bass are ambush predators. They're opportunists. They're waiting for something to come along that is going to be an easy meal for them. So in these type of situations, you're going to want to try to use some sort of jig is typically what I go to, or some sort of topwater, especially if you're trying to fish the transition line of the weed line, or even in the weeds themselves. A good frog or some sort of chapo would be great for you to use in these circumstances. Okay, so number 4 here, you're going to look for any sort of artificial or man-made structure. So think like docks, riffraff, or even pylons, or even Christmas trees that maybe have sunk down into the water. You're going to find these in a variety of different ways. Obviously, you're just going to see them out there. You're going to see them maybe on Google Earth, or if you're doing any sort of side scan or down scan, you might be able to find them that way. So I'm going to be flipping or pitching these areas. So I'm going to be throwing something like a wacky rig with a Senko, or some sort of Texas rig, creature bait, or even possibly Emo Kamushi. Look for these transition areas. They like to congregate around these structures. Anything that creates a difference in the water is something that is going to hold on to fish, hold on to bait fish, and hold on to bass. So the 5th place I'm going to look for is any sort of inlets or outlets that are bringing water into the lake or out of the lake. So think of any tributaries where you might have even some slow moving water, or especially if you have a rain that has happened a couple days, even a couple days before you're fishing this lake, you're going to have water that's flowing into these places. Bait fish and bass are going to naturally congregate in these places where fresh water is coming in, or you have some sort of current. These are great places to fish. You can either fish the shallow areas, fish the banks of these areas, or if you have any sort of moving water coming into the lake, like a river or a stream, there typically ends up being a little bowl that kind of develops where that river enters the lake, and it kind of creates a little bit of dip into the bottom of the lake just from the natural movement of the water, typically as it circulates. That is going to hold on to a bunch of fish. I've caught really good bass out of places like that. So these areas, what I'm going to throw is really dependent on the situation. You can throw anything from a horizontal moving bait like a jerk bait or a crankbait, or up to a jig and a Texas rig, creature bait, even a Carolina rig. So it really just kind of depends on what you're going to fish. If you're fishing the bank, I'm typically going to throw the creature bait with Texas rig. If you're fishing those bowls, I might be throwing some sort of crank or jerk bait or a Carolina rig, depending on the water depth that I'm in. Okay, so for bonus number 6, I'm going to call this the variables. Now the variables are going to decide probably what the best 1 through 5 that we've already talked about is going to be. So when we talk about the bonuses, we're referring to wind, current, sun, and temp. So when it comes to wind, if you have a west wind, you're going to want to try to fish the east side of your points, the east side of your flats, the east side of your shoreline. The reason being is because that wind, depending on the strength of it, is going to be pushing water into these places, which is going to push fish, which is going to push bass. Typically, you're going to see better fishing on these sides that are getting hit by the wind. So when it comes to sun, I am nowhere near the equator here up in Michigan. So I have a sun that sits a little bit lower in the southern sky. So that means that on especially sunny days, I'm going to have the north end of that lake heat up a lot faster because it's going to get direct sunlight than the south side of that lake. For example, if you have very cold water, it's going to be an advantage to fish the north side of the lake because that sun is going to heat up that water quicker and you're going to have more active bass in that side of the lake. But if you already have very warm water, again, the north side of that lake is going to heat up a lot faster, so you might have very sluggish bass on that side of the lake. Now this also comes into play when you think about shade, because the bass could be moving to docks or just general places on the lake that are shaded. So when it comes to current, there's a lot of different variables. You could go on and talk just about current in of itself, along with some of these other variables. Typically what I'll say, to keep it really simple, is that I would be looking for any sort of current that has some sort of pinch point or some sort of transition area. So kind of going back to where we're talking about drop-offs and stuff like that, if you have natural current into a lake, you're going to have ravines in that lake that the water is moving through. I would look for pinch points along those ravines where the natural movement of the water is occurring and it comes to a point. I would focus on those areas. Typically, I'd be hitting those with the Carolina rig. So when it comes to water temperature, bass like consistent temperatures. So as it's super cold, they're going to stay in deeper water where it's more consistent, but as it warms up, they're going to come up into the shallow water. Like when we come into spring, into early summer and they're spawning, they move into that shallow water. As we're getting into the dog days of summer, when it gets extremely hot, they move back and transition back into more deeper water where the water temperature is more consistent. What might change that is when you have inbound or outbound water that is moving, that might be cooler because it's coming in or spring fed. If it's hot, that also might drive them to shade and under docks and stuff like that to get out of the sun that's heating up the water around them. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe. If you have any comments, leave them in the comments section. If you want to see me do something in another video, let me know. I hope you guys have a great day and I'll see you next time.